Welcome back to Poirot Files. Today we're diving into an intriguing mystery, Hercule Poirot and the key that fit a door that didn't exist, a tale of deception, secrets, and Poirot's brilliant investigative mind. But before that, I want to say, you've shown me so much love and I truly appreciate it. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Grab your coffee and let's get started. Chapter 1. The Key and the Dead Man. The chill of an early morning mist clung to the overgrown lawns of Hawthorne Manor as I stood with Captain Hastings, watching the late spring fog lazily drift over the neglected gardens. The sky above was an insipid grey, thick with the promise of rain, and the house, an imposing structure of stone and ivy, loomed eerily in the distance. It had always struck me as a place of secrets, its turreted towers and arched windows like watchful eyes, surveying all who entered its gates. "It is a place, mon ami," I remarked to Hastings, "where one might easily feel that the walls have heard more than one cares to know." He nodded absently, his attention clearly divided between the house and the grim scene before us. The body of Mr. Julian Hawthorne had been found only hours ago in his study, an isolated room on the ground floor at the far end of the house. The room was still a dreadful mess, with furniture overturned and papers scattered, as though a violent struggle had taken place, but it was the strange, almost mocking nature of the scene that held my attention. Mr. Hawthorne was a wealthy, if somewhat insufferable, socialite. He had invited a number of people to his home for what was, by all accounts, a rather dull weekend gathering where old friendships were rekindled and pretentious conversations about art, politics, and the frivolity of the wealthy were the order of the day. No one could have predicted that the weekend would end in tragedy. "It was all so sudden," Captain Hastings muttered beside me. "One minute Hawthorne was hosting his guests with great flourish, and the next, well, this." I nodded, my thoughts already turning to the oddity of the case. The body had been discovered in the study, and nothing about the room seemed to make sense. Julian Hawthorne had been shot, a single bullet to the chest, with no apparent motive. But it was the key that intrigued me. It had been found lying next to him, half buried beneath a pile of papers, its metallic surface gleaming like some mocking riddle. It was an ordinary key in appearance, small, old-fashioned, with a brass handle. But there was something about it that gnawed at me. Hastings, of course, had missed the significance of it entirely. He was still struggling to understand the details of the crime. "It must have been a robbery gone wrong," Hastings continued, scratching his head. "Perhaps Hawthorne surprised the killer while he was searching for something valuable." "Perhaps," I replied, my tone disinterested. "But there is one thing, Hastings, that bothers me greatly. This key." I lifted the key from the table, inspecting it with the care of a jeweler studying a rare gemstone. It was a curious thing. It didn't appear to fit any lock in the house, and none of the guests or staff could provide any explanation for its presence. "Look at it closely," I said. "It is neither ornate nor simple. It seems to belong to a place that does not exist. But surely, Poirot, there must be a lock for it somewhere," Hastings suggested, peering over my shoulder. "Ah, Hastings, you have a mind like a hound on the scent," I said, smiling slightly. "But the problem, you see, is that no one, neither the staff nor the guests, knows of any lock in this house that could possibly accommodate it. Not one." "How could that be?" Hastings asked, his brow furrowing. "It's a key. Surely it opens something." "Precisely," I declared, my voice soft but firm. "But the question, my dear Hastings, is what?" I turned away from the key, my mind already swirling with possibilities. The house was filled with strange, half-forgotten corners, passageways that seemed designed to confuse more than they were meant to serve, and rooms that had long since lost their purpose. I knew that I had to begin my investigation with the guests, a group of wealthy, somewhat peculiar individuals who had gathered here under the pretense of celebration. I looked over to the group of guests now assembled in the drawing-room, where they were being questioned by the police. There was the widow, Mrs. Hawthorne, tearful, yet composed, her face a mask of shock, her daughter, Miss Eleanor Hawthorne, who appeared aloof, with an air of indifference that bordered on callousness, Gregory Trent, the business partner, a man whose nervy disposition suggested he knew far more than he let on, and finally the enigmatic new guest, Caroline Vane, an artist whose mere presence in the house seemed oddly out of place. "All these people have secrets," I muttered to myself. "It is a matter of uncovering them, piece by piece." Hastings, always eager to lend a hand, offered me a silent nod. "Where should we start, Poirot?" "First we speak to the widow," I said, my voice tinged with the faintest trace of amusement, "for I suspect that despite her grief there are things she has not told us. And then we shall see if the key holds the answers we seek." As we made our way toward the drawing-room, I could feel the weight of the key in my pocket pressing against my side like an ominous presence. It was as though it were whispering to me, urging me forward. The widow, Mrs. Hawthorne, was seated in a chair near the fireplace, surrounded by her circle of friends. She looked up as we entered, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from crying. Yet there was a certain poise about her, an air of control that was hard to ignore. "I am so terribly sorry for your loss, madame," I said, bowing slightly as I approached her. "May I offer my condolences?" "Thank you," Mrs. Hawthorne replied, her voice steady, though she glanced away quickly, as if ashamed of her composed demeanour. "It is a dreadful shock, Monsieur Poirot. Julian was... well, he had his faults, but he didn't deserve this. No one deserves such a fate." "Indeed," I said, leaning slightly forward, my gaze intent. "Tell me, madame, did your husband, Monsieur Hawthorne, ever mention a key, one like this?" I produced the key from my pocket and held it out for her to see. Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. The silence hung between us for a moment, as though she were deciding whether to speak the truth or offer another lie. I don't know," she said finally, her voice shaky. "I've never seen it before. It must be someone else's, perhaps the servants?" Her eyes darted briefly toward the staff, standing near the door, and then back to me. I studied her carefully. The subtle shift in her demeanour, the fleeting glance towards the staff. She was lying, of course. But why? What did the key have to do with her? I nodded thoughtfully, tucking the key back into my pocket. "Thank you, madame. You have been most helpful. We shall speak again, no doubt." As we left her company, I could feel Hastings' gaze on me, searching for any hint of what I had discovered. "Do you think she knows more than she's letting on?" Hastings asked, his voice filled with curiosity. "Ah, Hastings," I said with a small smile. "The lady knows something, certainly. But whether she knows all, that, I believe, is yet to be uncovered." We left the drawing-room, stepping back into the shadowed hall of Hawthorne Manor. The house was eerily quiet now, save for the soft murmur of voices. I could feel the weight of the key in my pocket, heavy with meaning, and I knew one thing for certain. Somewhere, hidden in this place of forgotten corners and locked doors, was the answer to a puzzle far more complicated than any I had yet encountered. As the fog continued to thicken outside, I felt the first stirrings of certainty. The key was not just a physical object, it was a symbol of a secret that someone was desperately trying to keep hidden, and it would be up to me, Hercule Poirot, to uncover it. With that, I turned towards the staircase, my mind already racing with possibilities. "Onward, Hastings," I said. "The game is afoot." And so, the mystery of the key that fit a door that didn't exist had begun. Chapter 2. A Mysterious Invitation. The next morning, the mist had barely lifted from the grounds of Hawthorne Manor. The fog lingered like an uninvited guest reluctant to leave, as though it too had been part of the murder and was now attempting to cling to the past. The manor, with its dark stone facade, stood solemnly amidst the damp landscape, almost as if it were mourning the violent death of Julian Hawthorne. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tensions, and the murmur of the remaining guests echoed down the corridors like distant whispers. Captain Hastings and I had spent most of the morning in Mr. Hawthorne's study, examining the room in greater detail. I had instructed the staff to keep their distance from the room as I meticulously examined every inch of the space. It was clear that a struggle had occurred, but nothing in the room seemed to lead to a definitive conclusion. I had found nothing new to add to my previous thoughts. However, as I turned the key over in my hand once more, something caught my eye. A small, almost imperceptible mark was visible near the base of the key. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a smudge of dirt, but upon closer inspection it seemed deliberate, a faint, worn groove. It was not the sort of mark one would expect from a key that had simply been lying around for a long time. It appeared as though it had been recently used in a lock, but not for long. A lock that had seen little use. I held the key up to the light and peered at it carefully. "Ah," I muttered to myself, "there is more to you than meets the eye." Turning to Hastings, who was sitting by the window and scanning the grounds, I spoke. "You know, Hastings, it is the small things, the subtle details that often lead to the greatest revelations. This mark, for instance, it suggests that this key has been used recently, but the question, as always, is why?" Hastings, ever the eager assistant, leaned over to look at the key, his face creasing with curiosity. "You think it means something? Could it be the key to a hidden room?" he asked, his voice tinged with excitement at the prospect of another mystery to unravel. "I do not know," I replied, my eyes narrowing as I examined the key further. "But it is a clue nonetheless. We must not overlook it." The sudden sound of footsteps interrupted our thoughts, and Mrs. Hawthorne appeared in the doorway, her figure a shadow against the light from the hall. She had dressed in black, a simple yet elegant gown that suited her mournful demeanour, but I could see the tightness in her posture, the rigidity of a woman trying too hard to maintain her composure. "I trust you are making progress, monsieur." "Poirot?" she asked, her voice brittle. "Progress, madame," I said with a slight bow, "is an elusive thing, but I assure you we are not yet at an end." "I do hope so," she replied, her eyes briefly flickering to the key in my hand. I wish to put this all behind me. The tragedy, the uncertainty, everything." Her words rang hollow in the room, and I could sense that beneath her carefully constructed mask of sorrow there was something far more complex, something she was hiding. "Indeed, madame," I said, lowering the key back into my pocket. "And yet the truth, as always, will not be so easily dismissed." She stiffened slightly at my words, but quickly recovered. I will leave you to your work. I just wanted to ask if you needed anything." I watched her leave, a strange sense of unease settling in my chest. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of guilt. or perhaps fear? I could not yet say, but I knew one thing. Mrs. Hawthorne knew far more than she was letting on. Turning back to Hastings, I began pacing slowly, the carpet beneath my shoes muffling my steps. I could not shake the feeling that there was more to this case than met the eye. Everything seemed to be set in motion with that one peculiar invitation Mr. Hawthorne had sent out to his guests. It had seemed innocent enough, a request for old friends to gather in the tranquil countryside for a quiet weekend. But the timing was strange, and the guests even stranger. "Tell me, Hastings," I began, pausing before him, "what do you know of the other guests, the people Mr. Hawthorne invited?" Hastings, ever eager to share his knowledge, began recounting his observations. "Well, of course, there is Mrs. Hawthorne, the widow, as we've just seen. Then there is her daughter, Miss Eleanor Hawthorne. You may recall that she seemed a bit distant, not quite mourning her father's death, if you ask me. But then again, she's always been that way. They say she was spoiled rotten as a child." "Ah, but what of the others?" I pressed, eager to hear more. "Yes, of course," Hastings continued. "There's Gregory Trent, Mr. Hawthorne's business partner. He's a bit of a nervous man, always on edge. Quite the fidgeter, actually. He and
Julian had a rather tempestuous relationship, to say the least. Money was involved, I believe, though no one would say much about it." "Ah, yes. A partnership of convenience, I suspect?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Exactly," Hastings agreed.
But what struck me as odd was the presence of Caroline Vane. She's a painter, I believe. A woman of some renown in certain circles. She was the only one who seemed completely out of place at the gathering. She barely knew anyone, but there she was, part of the mix, as if she were invited for reasons other than friendship. I paused, absorbing this new information. A woman who is unfamiliar with the others, yet still invited. Very curious indeed. "It does seem suspicious," Hastings admitted, though he appeared less convinced. "But I suppose Mr. Hawthorne must have had his reasons." I raised a hand, signalling for him to hold his thoughts. "It is not simply her presence that troubles me, Hastings. It is the invitation itself. Why would Julian Hawthorne invite all of them at once? And why such a vague request? He said very little in his letter about the purpose of the weekend. In fact, he said almost nothing about the gathering at all, only that it was for old friends to reconnect, a rather convenient excuse for
"A man with something to hide," Hastings frowned, his expression growing more serious. "So you think Mr. Hawthorne invited these people for some other reason?"
"Not just a friendly gathering?" "Exactly," I replied. There was something in the way he phrased the invitation, something off. It's as though he knew the end was near, or perhaps he had something planned that required all these people in one place. Something he could not afford to leave to chance. But what? I turned my attention back to the key in my pocket, its weight pressing against me like a reminder. The mark. It was almost as if it were beckoning me to investigate further. It was no ordinary key, no common object. There was more to this key than a mere lock. It was as if Mr. Hawthorne had hidden a secret, his secret, and now it was up to me to uncover it. As I looked out of the window, the fog was starting to break, the sun's first rays piercing through the clouds and casting long shadows across the lawn. The light, so feeble at first, began to grow stronger, illuminating the house in a way that seemed almost deliberate. It was then that I realized the key might not be the only thing that didn't fit in this house. The guests, the strange invitation, and the very air in Hawthorne Manor all felt like pieces of a puzzle that refused to align. But it was only a matter of time before they would, one by one. "Let us speak with the others, Hastings," I said, a note of finality in my voice. I have a feeling that the answers we seek are closer than we think. And so, with purpose in my stride, we set out to meet the remaining guests, each of them holding their own secrets, each of them hiding something. But I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the truth would soon reveal itself. Chapter 3. The Mansion and its Secret. The light from the afternoon sun filtered in through the heavy curtains of the grand drawing-room, casting elongated shadows that seemed to dance across the faded velvet furniture. There was an uneasy stillness in the air, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. The peculiarities of the crime scene were still fresh in my mind, but I knew that I must press on. The key, with its strange mark and uncertain origin, was only the beginning. Hastings and I had left the study and begun our inspection of the rest of the house. The place was expansive, too expansive perhaps, a sprawling mansion set deep in the countryside. Hawthorne Manor was the epitome of a bygone era, with its overgrown gardens, grand staircases, and dimly lit corridors. The kind of house that seemed to have more rooms than it could possibly need, yet each one held a secret, an untold story. As we moved through the house, I could sense the weight of its history pressing down upon me, the secrets that lingered in the corners of the walls, the quiet whispers of forgotten conversations. My sharp eyes never missed a detail. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, with faded portraits lining the walls. I had been through this part of the house already, but something caught my eye, a door. It was located at the end of the corridor, tucked between two rooms, and yet it appeared to be locked. This was strange. The door was not marked as part of any private rooms or storage areas. It was simply there. "Hastings, do you see that door?" I asked, my voice low, though I was sure the house would not betray my inquiry. Hastings, who had been absorbed in studying the tapestries on the opposite wall, glanced over and nodded. "I do, Poirot, but I don't recall seeing it before. It doesn't seem to fit with the rest of the house." "Exactly," I murmured, stepping toward the door. My fingers brushed lightly against the wood, feeling the coolness of its surface. There was something unnatural about it, something that set it apart. The lock was old but sturdy, and the door itself was of a solid oak, not the flimsy panels you might expect in a neglected part of the house. It looked out of place, as though it
had been added after the fact, or perhaps hidden. "Have you noticed anything odd about this house, Hastings?"
I asked, without taking my eyes off the door. Hastings scratched his head thoughtfully, clearly puzzled. "Well, there's something about the atmosphere in here. It's almost as if the place is haunted by its own past. But as for the door, it's certainly not a place I've ever been before. Perhaps one of the servants can explain it to us?" "Yes, perhaps," I replied, though I had a sinking feeling that whatever lay behind that door was more important than any of the staff could ever reveal. Turning back toward the stairs, I motioned for Hastings to follow. "Come, we will start with the staff. Their impressions of the household will reveal far more than they realize." The staff at Hawthorne Manor was an eclectic group, each of them carrying an air of secrecy that seemed almost contagious. We began with the housekeeper, Mrs. Mercer, a stern woman of indeterminate age whose expression rarely changed from a thin-lipped grimace. She led us to a small sitting room at the rear of the house, where she stood rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, awaiting my first question. "Tell me, Mrs. Mercer," I began, my tone polite but firm, "do you know anything about that locked door at the end of the hall?" Her lips tightened further, and she glanced nervously over her shoulder. I do not, Monsieur Poirot. It has been locked for as long as I have worked here.
No one has ever mentioned it except for Mr. Hawthorne, of course. He had his reasons for keeping it shut. And those reasons were? I pressed, my gaze fixed on her face. She hesitated, a brief flicker of something, fear, crossing her features.
Before she recovered. He never told me, sir. Only that it was a private matter and no one was to ask about it. I studied her carefully. No one was to ask about it? I repeated slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. Curious, nests.
Pass.
She cleared her throat, as though trying to dispel the tension that had gathered in the room. Yes, well, you'll have to ask Mr. Trent about that, Monsieur Poirot. He was always the one to take charge of Mr. Hawthorne's personal matters. Mr. Trent? I inquired, raising an eyebrow. The business partner? Yes, sir. He managed a lot of Mr. Hawthorne's affairs, and he was often the one to deal with such sensitive things, she added, her voice low. This was an interesting lead. Very well, Mrs. Mercer. You have been most helpful. I gave her a slight nod and turned toward Hastings. Come, let us speak with Mr. Trent. We found Mr. Trent in the library, a large, imposing room filled with dark mahogany bookshelves that seemed to close in on the visitor. He was seated at a desk, sorting through some papers with great concentration. When we entered, he looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as though irritated by the interruption. But he stood quickly, smoothing his trousers and offering a tight smile. Ah, Poirot, he said, his voice smooth but strained. I trust everything is in order? As much as it can be under the circumstances, Mr. Trent, I replied, my voice casual, though I was paying close attention to his every move. You are the one who handled Mr. Hawthorne's personal affairs, n'est-ce pas? Tell me about the locked door in the hallway. A flicker of unease crossed his face, but it was gone almost instantly, replaced by a stiff formality. Ah, yes, that door, he said, almost too quickly. I never gave it much thought. It's a part of the house that Mr. Hawthorne preferred to keep to himself. A private matter, as Mrs. Mercer must have told you. Private, you say? I asked, studying him carefully. Interesting. You are quite sure there is nothing unusual about it? He paused, and for a moment I thought he might crack under the pressure. But then he composed himself, offering a thin smile. I assure you, Poirot, you're looking too deeply into things. The house is full of oddities, after all. The lock is nothing to worry about. I knew better than to let such a statement slide by. Ah, but this lock, Mr. Trent, is not like the others in the house, is it? I pressed, letting my words hang in the air. He stiffened, his eyes darting toward the door, as if contemplating escape. I believe I've said all I can, Poirot, he said, his voice suddenly cold. I did not press him further at that moment, but I made a mental note of his discomfort. There was more to Mr. Trent's story than he was letting on. Very well, Mr. Trent, I said with a small smile. I thank you for your time. I shall leave you to your work. As we left the library, Hastings turned to me. Poirot, do you think Trent knows more than he's saying? Undoubtedly, I replied, my mind already turning over the implications of his words. He has a great deal to hide, I suspect. Our next stop was the widow, Mrs. Hawthorne. She was in the drawing-room, sitting with a glass of water in her hands, her expression unreadable. When we entered, she did not even look up at first. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, she said finally, her voice flat. I suppose you've come to ask me more questions? Indeed, madame, I replied. There are still some matters that require clarification. This house, it has many secrets, no? And you, madame, are you one of those secrets? She blinked, startled by my bluntness. I don't understand what you mean." "Let me be clear, madame," I said, my tone unwavering. "You are not a fool, and neither am I. The invitation that your late husband sent out was no mere social gathering, was it? There was something more behind it, and I would suggest you stop pretending otherwise." Her hands trembled slightly, and she glanced toward the window, as though hoping the landscape outside might offer her an escape. But there was no easy way out of this. "Perhaps," she said slowly. "You are right, Monsieur Poirot. Perhaps there was more to it than I have let on. The truth was closer than I had anticipated, and yet there was still a great deal I needed to uncover." "Very well," I said, my voice low but decisive. "I will have answers, Mrs. Hawthorne. You can be certain of that." As I turned toward the door, I caught the faintest glimmer in her eyes, one of fear, but also something else, something that hinted at a deeper involvement than I had suspected. Chapter 4. The widow's alibi. The atmosphere in the drawing-room remained thick with tension as I turned to Mrs. Hawthorne, who had barely moved since I last addressed her. She sat by the window, her delicate fingers wrapped tightly around the glass of water, her face pale and drawn. I had observed her reactions closely, how her lips trembled, how her eyes, though large and dark, held a guarded quality that suggested more calculation than genuine grief. There was something unsettling about her demeanor, as though she were playing a role in a drama of which she had rehearsed every line. I could not help but wonder, was it truly sorrow she felt, or the weight of a well-constructed performance? "Madame," I began gently, lowering my voice, "it is difficult to imagine the pain you must be feeling. But there are certain matters we must address if we are to find the truth. Your late husband, Mr. Hawthorne, was a man of great means, n'est-ce pas?" She blinked, startled by the directness of my question. "Yes, of course," she replied quickly, as though she had rehearsed her response. "Julian was very wealthy, but he was also difficult. He had many business dealings that were, well, complex." Her tone was calculated, but there was something in her eyes, a fleeting flicker that suggested she was holding back. The wealth of the Hawthorne family was well known, as was Mr. Hawthorne's ability to make sharp financial decisions, though rumors about the man's many enemies had circulated. "For years, you must understand," I continued, "that I am not here to cause you distress, but to uncover the truth. And that brings me to a question that is difficult. Did Mr. Hawthorne leave behind any specific instructions for you regarding his affairs, particularly in the event of his untimely passing?" Her fingers tightened around the glass in her hand. For a brief moment I thought she might refuse to answer, but then she gave a resigned sigh and spoke, her voice steady, yet betraying an undercurrent of unease. "Yes, he had a life insurance policy," she said, the words coming out almost too easily. "A substantial one. I believe it was worth £500,000. "£500,000?" I repeated, allowing the shock to show on my face. "That is indeed a considerable sum. And you, madame, were the beneficiary, yes?" She nodded, though her expression remained unchanged. "Yes. Julian was always careful to make sure I was provided for. He would never leave me without anything." "And you, madam," I said, allowing my gaze to sharpen slightly, "were you aware of any threats to his life? Any reason why he might have been worried about his safety in the days leading up to his death?" The question hung in the air, and she seemed to consider it for a long moment. Finally, she shook her head. "No, nothing like that. Julian was... well, he was a difficult man, but I don't think anyone would have harmed him."
"At least I hope not." I observed her closely, noting the subtle hesitation in her words. Your alibi, madame. Where were you at the time of your husband's death? She stiffened slightly, and for a moment I wondered if I had struck too close to
the heart of the matter. I was in the garden, she answered quickly, but her eyes darted toward the window as if searching for an escape. I was walking alone by the rose bushes. I didn't hear anything and I didn't see anyone. Alone, you say? I pressed. Was there no one who could verify this for you? Anyone who saw you at that time? Her gaze faltered, and I could see a hint of panic behind her mask of composure. No. No one, she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I swear I was there. I didn't hear anything strange. The house, it was quiet as it always is. I let the silence hang between us, allowing the weight of her answer to settle. Her alibi was weak, far too flimsy to be taken at face value, and her failure to provide any corroborating witness was telling. As a widow of such means, it was hardly believable that she had been alone during a time as crucial as this. Tell me, I asked, shifting my attention to the table beside her, where several objects were scattered. This key. I picked up the small metal object from the surface, the key we found near the body of your husband. It appears to be an important piece of this puzzle. Do you recognize it, madame? She paled as I held it up for her to see. The key was intricate, with an ornate head and a thin, sharp shaft. As I turned it in my hand, I noticed a faint marking on one side, a symbol, barely visible to the naked eye. That seemed almost deliberate. It was a strange, circular design, like a seal or an insignia, the kind of mark that would not appear by accident. Mrs. Hawthorne leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the key. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. She looked suddenly unsettled. I don't know what that symbol is, she stammered, her usual composure unravelling. It certainly wasn't anything that belonged to Julian. He never mentioned anything like it. But the key itself, madame, I continued, my voice calm yet insistent. You are sure it is not familiar to you? She looked down at the key, her fingers twitching as if she might reach for it, but she held herself back. No, it is not. It must have been placed there by someone else, perhaps by the servants, or even by Mr. Trent. Mr. Trent? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Ah, yes, the business partner. You have mentioned him before. Do you believe he has some involvement in your husband's death? Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze flickered briefly toward the door. I don't know, she said quickly, her voice trembling. But he was always around, always involved in Julian's business. Perhaps he knows something about the key. I could sense the undercurrent of something deeper at play, something she was either too afraid or too careful to articulate. There was a story here, but it was not one she was ready to tell. Very well, madam, I said softly, my voice reassuring. I will speak with Mr. Trent, but know this. Your husband's death is no accident, and neither is this key. There is more to this mystery than meets the eye. I turned and gave her a polite nod, leaving her with her thoughts. As we left the room, I could feel Hastings watching me with a quiet curiosity, but he said nothing. He knew better than to interrupt when I was lost in thought. As we made our way down the hallway, I could not shake the feeling that we were drawing closer to the heart of the mystery. Mrs. Hawthorne's behaviour had been too rehearsed, too calculated. She had something to hide, and I would uncover it. But the key, that symbol, it was no ordinary key. and I suspected it held the key not just to a locked door, but to a much larger secret. As I glanced at the key once more, I could not help but wonder, was this key the key to a door that did not exist, or perhaps the key to something far more sinister? Chapter 5. The Daughter's Past. I had seen many things in my years as a detective, but there was a certain unsettling quality to Miss Eleanor Hawthorne that made her stand out among the many suspects in this case. I had observed her from afar, earlier in the day, a picture of youthful aloofness, her eyes distant as she stared out at the manicured grounds of the estate. But it wasn't the aloofness that bothered me, it was the way she seemed almost too interested in the proceedings, the murder of her own father, and, more specifically, in the details of the investigation. It was a suspicion I had kept to myself, but it gnawed at me. The way she listened, the way she almost seemed to be studying the others as much as they were studying her. It was as if she were already playing a part in a drama that had yet to unfold. That evening, after leaving Mrs. Hawthorne, I made my way upstairs to Miss Eleanor's room. Hastings, ever faithful, had been busy speaking with the staff, but I had decided that my focus needed to be on the daughter. Her aloof demeanour and suspicious attentiveness warranted closer inspection. Perhaps, I thought, she was hiding something, and I was intent on finding out what that something was. The room was quiet, the heavy curtains drawn against the fading daylight. It was an elegant space, of course, befitting the daughter of a wealthy
man, but there was something off about it. The room had an almost sterile quality, too orderly for a young woman's retreat.
A few books on a shelf, a writing desk with only a few scattered papers, and a chair by the window where she had no doubt spent many hours contemplating. What exactly? I stood there for a moment, allowing my mind to sift through the details. Before I began my search, everything in this room spoke of restraint, but what was it that Eleanor was holding back? Miss Hawthorne has been remarkably quiet today, Hastings had said to me earlier. Almost too quiet, if you ask me. She didn't seem overly distraught, not in the way one would expect from someone who had just lost a father. That is precisely what concerns me, I had replied. When a person is too quiet, it often means they are hiding something, or perhaps they already know more than they should. Now, as I examined her room, I had the distinct feeling that I was not about to uncover the usual evidence of a grieving daughter. I began by looking through her desk drawers, my fingers brushing across the smooth, polished wood. There was nothing unusual at first, just papers, a few bills, and some correspondence. But then, beneath a stack of rather mundane letters, I found a single envelope, tucked carefully beneath the others. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. To Eleanor, with love, from Charles. I frowned as I read the name, Charles. The name rang a bell, and the memories came flooding back. The vanished man, Charles Griffiths, a former suitor of Miss Eleanor's, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances several years ago. The disappearance had created quite a stir in society circles at the time, though it had never been solved. Many had assumed the young man had simply gone abroad, or perhaps had met with some tragic accident, but no one knew for sure. It was one of those cases that faded into the background, forgotten by the public eye, though the whispers never truly stopped. I opened the letter carefully, not wanting to damage the fragile paper. The contents were brief, but chilling in their intimacy. Eleanor's relationship with Charles had been much more than just a casual affair. There was something deeper here, something secret. Dearest Eleanor, I can't bear the thought of being apart from you any longer. You must know that I love you, and I would do anything to be with you. Do not listen to the others. Our love is stronger than any obstacle. I have a plan, and I will Not rest until we are together. Yours always, Charles. I sat for a moment, holding the letter in my hands. What was it about this letter that unsettled me so? The passion was evident, but it was more than that. There was an undercurrent of urgency, of something being hidden in the shadows. The reference to a plan and the insistence that she not listen to the others struck me as strange. It was almost as if Charles had been plotting something Eleanor had been complicit in. But why was this letter hidden away? My mind raced as I pondered the connection between the letter and Charles's disappearance. Had it been something more than a mere romantic separation? Could it be that the young man had met with foul play? And was Eleanor involved in some way? I placed the letter back in its envelope carefully, as though it were a fragile clue I had no right to disturb. As I stood there, still contemplating the implications of my discovery, the door to the room opened quietly. I turned to find Miss Eleanor standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Poirot," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of surprise. "I didn't expect you to be here." I did not move, allowing the silence to hang between us for a moment before I spoke. "It seems I have discovered something unexpected, mademoiselle." Her gaze flickered toward the desk, and then back to me. There was no hint of alarm in her face, just that same calm, distant expression, as though she were watching a play unfold before her. "You have been through my things, then?" she asked, her tone even. I suppose I should have expected that. "I assure you, mademoiselle," I replied, not breaking eye contact. "I only seek the truth, and sometimes the truth is hidden in the smallest of details." "Such as an old letter?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "You must realize, Poirot, that things are not always as they seem." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. "Indeed, that is precisely—"
"Why, I must ask you, Miss Hawthorne, about this man, Charles Griffiths. His disappearance is still very much a part of this story, is it not?" For the briefest moment her mask slipped, and I saw something flicker in her eyes, something that
might have been guilt, or perhaps fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same cold, composed demeanour. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice steady. "Charles Griffiths was a part of my past, nothing more." "Ah," I replied, my voice soft, "but the past, Miss Hawthorne, has a way of catching up with us when we least expect it." She took a step toward me, her gaze sharp. "Are you accusing me of something, Poirot?" I tilted my head, considering her carefully. "I am not accusing you, mademoiselle, but I do believe you know more than you are telling me. The question is why you are reluctant to speak of it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The room was heavy with the weight of unspoken words, the silence, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves outside. Finally, Eleanor spoke again, her voice quieter, more controlled. "You may think you know what happened, but you do not. You will not find the answers you are looking for here." "That remains to be seen, mademoiselle," I replied, my tone firm but not unkind. "But I will find them. And when I do, the truth will come out." With that, I turned and left her room, the faint smell of lavender lingering in the air behind me. Chapter 6. A red herring from the business partner, I left Miss Eleanor's room with a lingering sense of unease. There were more questions than answers, and I could feel the case slipping further into shadow. But one thing I knew for certain. Miss Hawthorne was hiding something, and whatever it was key to understanding the death of her father. But there were other threads to pull, and I had not forgotten the importance of the business partner, Mr. Gregory Trent. His name had come up repeatedly during my earlier inquiries, always in connection to Mr. Hawthorne's financial dealings. From what I had gathered, the two men had been close friends for many years, but recently their relationship had seemed strained. If I had learned anything from my years of experience, it was that when finances were involved, there was always the potential for dark motives. I found Trent in the drawing room, alone, pacing nervously by the fireplace. He had not seen me enter, and I observed him for a moment, noting his stiff posture, his restless hands, and the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. There was an air of guilt about him, though he seemed determined to conceal it. "Mr. Trent," I said, making my presence known. He startled slightly, but quickly masked it with a forced smile.
"Ah, Poirot, I didn't see you there. How can I help you?" "I trust you are well, monsieur?" I asked, my voice calm and measured. He nodded, but seemed eager to move past the pleasantries. "Yes, of course. Well enough, considering the circumstances."
A tragedy, really. Julian was... well, he was a good man, a good friend. "You were quite close, were you not?" I asked, studying him intently. Yes, we were. But things had been difficult recently. Julian was more distant, and the business, well, it wasn't doing as well as it used to. I raised an eyebrow. "Ah, that brings us to the matter of finances, then." Trent's face tightened, though he quickly recovered. "What do you mean?" "We had our disagreements, yes, but nothing that would lead to something like this." "Nothing, Poirot." "Ah, but you were... how do you say?" "In a difficult situation financially, no?" I pressed, watching as his eyes flicked momentarily to the door, as though checking if anyone might overhear. "Yes," he admitted, his voice dropping. "I was struggling. Julian and I had made some investments together, and some of them hadn't panned out. The business was on the edge of failing, and there were loans, large loans, that I couldn't cover. I was desperate. And yet," I continued, "you had no need to kill your partner, I presume. You had only to ask him for assistance." "Ask
"Him?" Trent scoffed. "He had no intention of helping. We'd discussed it, but Julian was cold toward me. He didn't care about the business anymore, didn't care about anything except his hobbies. He had no intention of saving the company, Poirot. No intention at all." I said nothing for a moment, allowing his words to settle between us. Was this man simply a victim of circumstances, as he claimed, or had his desperation led
him down a darker path? "I see," I said at last. "You felt cornered. But did that lead you to murder, to take such drastic measures?" Trent stiffened, clearly affronted by the suggestion. "I did not kill Julian. I would never—" "Then why did you lie about your whereabouts the night of the murder?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. The colour drained from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. For a brief moment he appeared paralyzed by his own thoughts. I wasn't in the house that night," he stammered finally, his voice shaky. I went for a walk. It was late, and I needed to clear my head. I thought Julian was already asleep. He was often in his study late. I didn't expect him to be—" He trailed off, his eyes darting nervously to the side. "Ah," I said, feeling a glimmer of something sharper form in the back of my mind. "You didn't expect him to be what, monsieur? To be alive?" Trent flushed, his unease suddenly giving way to agitation. "I didn't mean it like that, Poirot. I was upset, yes, but I didn't kill him." I fixed him with a stare, my gaze unblinking. "And yet your motive remains. The debts, the business, these are not trifles, but we shall see." Poirot, please, Trent said, his voice more desperate now. I've told you everything. I didn't— Very well, I interrupted, but you will remain a suspect, monsieur, until I know more. In the meantime, I shall examine the house in greater detail. There may be something there that will explain what should I say? Your unusual behavior. As I left him, I felt no closer to an answer, but certainly more suspicious. There was something in his manner that didn't sit right with me. The financial struggles could have been a motive, but his agitation, the rapid shifts in his emotions, it was as though he were hiding something. The more he spoke, the more certain I became that there was more to his story than he let on. Returned to the scene of the crime, Mr. Hawthorne's study, a room I had already observed but felt compelled to revisit. The key had been found near the body, and it seemed to be of central importance. But what did it unlock? I studied the key once more, its polished surface glinting faintly in the dim light. I had noticed before that there was something off about it, but now, under the closer scrutiny of the study's dim lamplight, I saw it, barely visible but unmistakable, a symbol etched into the shaft of the key. A symbol so faint that one could easily overlook it, but one that seemed deliberate. I pressed my thumb against the engraving, and it was then that I realized what it was, a stylized version of a keyhole, but not one I recognized. It was faint, worn down by age, but it was there, an almost imperceptible hint that this key might be meant for something other than the visible locks in the house. I examined the room again, taking careful note of every piece of furniture, every object. A locked drawer, perhaps, a hidden compartment. It was clear that the key was important, not just as a tool to unlock something physical, but as a symbol. Something was hidden here, in plain sight, and I was determined to find it. I was just about to search the desk when Hastings entered the room, his face drawn, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "Poirot, I've been speaking with the staff," he said, his voice low. "There's something odd about the way they've been behaving. I think they know more than they're letting on." I turned to him, my mind racing. "Tell me, Hastings, what did they say?" "They're tight-lipped," Hastings replied, "but there are whispers. I've been speaking with Mrs. Martin, the housekeeper. She mentioned that Mr. Hawthorne had recently hired a specialist to install a secret compartment somewhere in the house. She didn't know where exactly, but she said it was meant to protect something valuable. A safe, perhaps? A secret compartment. A hidden safe. This was it, the clue I had been waiting for. The key, then, was not just for any door or lock, it was for something far more elusive. "Thank you, Hastings," I said, my voice sharp with renewed purpose. "You have given me the final piece of the puzzle." Chapter 7. The unlikely newcomer, the discovery of the secret compartment, had stirred up a frenzy of thoughts in my mind, but now I had to shift my attention elsewhere. The key, which had loomed so large in my investigation, was now connected to a hidden space within the mansion, a place no one seemed to remember, yet one that could hold the answer to Mr. Hawthorne's
untimely death.
The threads were beginning to weave together, but there was still one more person to consider, one whose presence had only recently come to my attention, Caroline Vane, the artist. I had observed her at the edges of the gathering, a figure of mystery and quiet intensity. She had arrived late, the last guest to join the circle, and her aloof demeanour had not gone unnoticed. She had been introduced to me only in passing, yet her name had hovered in the background of my inquiries. It seemed as though she had known Mr. Hawthorne in the past, an old acquaintance, perhaps even a former lover. But what did this have to do with the murder? I found her in the drawing-room, standing by a window, staring out at the garden, as if lost in thought. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over her delicate features. Her appearance was that of an artist, unconventional, yet undeniably striking. Her eyes, sharp and dark, followed me as I entered the room. "Ah, Poirot," she said, her voice calm but tinged with something I could not quite place. "I've been
wondering when you'd come to speak with me." "You have been waiting for me, madame?" I inquired, keeping my tone light but attentive.
"Not exactly," she replied with a small smile. "But I know how these things work. You'll speak to all of us eventually, won't you?" "Indeed, I shall. But it is not so much that I seek to question you, madame. It is more that I seek to understand." I paused, gauging her reaction. "You knew Mr. Hawthorne, yes?" She nodded, her gaze turning distant. "I did. A long time ago. He was a complicated man." "Complicated?" I echoed, leaning forward slightly. "In what way, may I ask?" Caroline hesitated before answering, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her teacup. Julian was always torn between his public life and his private one. He had a restless nature, a thirst for something he could never quite satisfy. We had a connection, but it was never simple. You could say there were secrets, things we never discussed openly.
"A connection," I repeated, my mind turning over her words. "But not one that would explain his death, I presume." She met my eyes, her expression unreadable. "No, of course not. What could it possibly have to do with me?" I was about to respond
when something caught my eye. Across the room, near the mantel, hung a portrait. I had noticed it earlier, but now, as I studied it more closely, I saw that the subject was a painting of the mansion. The style was unmistakable, Caroline's work, no doubt. But it was not the mansion as I had seen it. It was an older, more imposing structure, one that seemed to contain a mystery of its own. "That is quite an interesting piece," I remarked, walking toward the painting. "It does not resemble the current version of the house, does it?" Caroline joined me, her gaze following mine. "No," she said, her voice soft, almost reluctant. "It's an earlier view of the mansion. I painted it several years ago before it
was renovated. You see, there was a door there on the left where the garden is now."
I stared at the painting, noting the precise way the door was depicted. It was a simple wooden door, unadorned, yet it seemed oddly out of place in the context of the rest of the mansion. It wasn't listed in any of the house's current plans, and yet here it was, clearly visible in Caroline's depiction. "That door," I said, my voice steady. "What happened to it? Was it removed during the renovations?" Caroline shifted uncomfortably, her fingers now clasped tightly in front of her. "It was never spoken of after the renovations. I suppose no one
wanted to remember it. There were things behind that door, things we couldn't explain. And when the house was altered, that door was sealed."
"Sealed?" I echoed. "But why? What was behind it?" She hesitated again, as though weighing whether or not to answer. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "Julian had a certain fascination with the occult," she said, her voice low. "He wasn't a man to be easily frightened, but there were things in that house, things he thought belonged to another time. He was searching for something, Poirot? Something he thought could change everything." "Searching for something?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "What precisely was he looking for?" Caroline shook her head slowly. "I don't know. But there were rumors, whispers. Some of the old servants talked about strange events, unexplainable noises, things disappearing, objects moving on their own. It was unsettling. And that door, it had something to do with it?" "Something to do with what, madame?" I pressed. Could you be more specific? I can't explain it, she said, her voice barely a whisper now. But Julian became obsessed with it. He thought that if he could find the right key, well, he thought he could unlock something that had been hidden for a very long time. My mind raced, pieces falling into place. The key that had been found near Mr. Hawthorne's body. The key that had fit no lock in the house. Could it be the key to this very door? Was this key meant to unlock the mystery that had haunted Julian Hawthorne? And what do you think, madame? I asked, my voice firm. Could this key unlock the secrets of that door? Caroline's expression was inscrutable, but there was a flicker of something, fear, in her eyes. I don't know, Poirot, but I have a feeling that Julian was close to discovering something that would have changed everything. Her words hung in the air between us, thick with unspoken implications. I stood in silence for a moment, taking in what she had said. The key, the door, the secrets hidden in the walls of the mansion, they were all connected. But the question remained. What exactly was hidden behind that door, and who would go to such lengths to protect it? As I left Caroline Vane, my mind was swirling with the possibilities. There were still so many questions, so many loose ends. But one thing was certain: the key was no longer just an object of curiosity. It was a key to a much larger puzzle, one that held the potential to reveal a truth far more dangerous than I had yet imagined. Chapter 8. Psychological insights and flashbacks. The evening was creeping upon the mansion, and the air felt heavy, thick with the weight of secrets that had yet to be uncovered. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something, anything to shift and reveal the truth. The pieces of the puzzle had begun to form an unsettling image, but there were still too many gaps, too many shadows lurking in the corners of my mind. I stood by the window in my room, watching the fading light sink below the horizon, my thoughts wandering back to the earlier conversation with Caroline Vane. The image of that mysterious door painted in her artwork clung to my mind, stubbornly refusing to be dismissed. Behind it, she had hinted, lay something far more sinister than any of us had suspected, a secret that had been buried, both physically and psychologically, deep within the mansion. But what was this secret, and how was it connected to Mr. Hawthorne's death? I turned away from the window, my gaze settling on the key that lay on the table before me. Its presence in my investigation had been constant, like an omen that refused to be ignored. That key, its faint symbol, its enigmatic history, was the key to unlocking not just the mystery of the house, but also the darker forces that had driven someone to kill Julian Hawthorne. As I sat down and began to sort through my notes, I allowed my thoughts to drift back to the psychological profile
of the crime.
There was something about this murder that gnawed at me, a certain urgency, an obsession in the mind of the killer. This was not a simple crime of passion or greed. No, this murder had been carefully orchestrated, driven by something far more complex, a deep-rooted fear perhaps, or a desperation to destroy something hidden. The more I pondered, the more it became clear. This was not just a matter of money. Mr. Hawthorne's life had been full of complications that had nothing to do with business or wealth, but rather with his heart, his desires, and the secrets he had kept from those closest to him. There were psychological scars here, buried under layers of charm and affluence. These were not wounds of the body, but of the soul. I closed my eyes and began to reconstruct Mr. Hawthorne's life in my mind, trying to see beyond the facade of a successful businessman and socialite. What had driven him to this point? What had brought him to the edge of his own destruction? A flashback to a conversation with Captain Hastings earlier that afternoon returned to me, a remark he had made about Hawthorne's personal life. "It's funny," Hastings had said, as we stood in the drawing room, "but there's something almost tragic about the way Hawthorne lived, always looking for something but never finding it." He was married, of course, to a woman who was more his opposite than anything else. But then there was that affair. The one with the woman from the village. The woman from the village. The words echoed in my mind like a whisper from the past that had been forgotten by most. I had not yet had the chance to investigate this aspect of Mr. Hawthorne's life, but something about it now seemed important, perhaps even central to the mystery. I closed my eyes again, this time allowing my mind to drift back deeper into the recesses of time. I saw the face of a younger Julian Hawthorne, a man with a different sort of intensity. There was a flicker of impatience in his eyes, a restlessness that had followed him through the years. He had been a man searching for something, driven by a desire to conquer what others thought was unattainable. The affair had begun years earlier, before the mansion had been renovated, before the key had been forged. It had been with a woman named Eleanor Ravis, a village girl with a sharp mind and a dangerous allure. She had not been of Mr. Hawthorne's class, and that had only made the affair more enticing. But what had begun as a passionate escape from his monotonous marriage had quickly turned into something darker. Eleanor Ravis was no innocent girl. She had been as much a player in this affair as Hawthorne himself. Their love had not been pure. It had been manipulative, full of games and
power struggles.
But Eleanor had been more than just a lover. She had been, in a way, a catalyst. She had spoken of things, strange things, that had planted the seeds of Hawthorne's obsession with unlocking the past. She had told him stories of ancient rituals, of forgotten keys and secret doors, of things that should never be disturbed. At the time, Hawthorne had laughed off her words as mere fancy, but something in him had clicked, and he had become obsessed with the idea of searching for something hidden in the mansion. As the affair had progressed, it became clear that Eleanor had had her own plans that had nothing to do with love. She had wanted more than just Hawthorne's attention. She had wanted to own him, to control him. It was she who had convinced him to search for the hidden door, to unlock the secrets of the house, and it was she who had ultimately disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a few faded letters and a trail of questions. As I pondered this, a sense of unease grew within me. Was this what had led to Mr. Hawthorne's death? Was it the lingering obsession with the past, the desire to uncover something that had been better left hidden, that had driven him to his end? I stood up and began pacing the room. There were still too many unanswered questions. The key, for instance, what had it unlocked? Was it simply a physical door, or did it represent something deeper? A psychological door into a past that had never truly been laid to rest. In my mind, I could see the final moments before the murder. Julian Hawthorne, perhaps alone in his study, examining the key once more, knowing that he was close to finding the hidden door. Perhaps a door that had been locked for reasons far darker than mere security. He had believed that unlocking it would provide him with answers. But what if it had led him to something far worse? Something that had driven him to fear for his life. Perhaps the killer had been someone who feared what Hawthorne would discover, a person so desperate to keep the secrets buried that they had resorted to murder. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hall. followed by a gentle knock at the door. It was Captain Hastings, come to see if I had made any progress. "Poirot," he said, as he entered, his expression serious. "Have you learned anything new?" I turned to him, my face solemn. "I have learned much, Hastings, but there is still much that remains hidden. It seems that the murder of Julian Hawthorne was not motivated by wealth or greed, but by something far more dangerous, an obsession with secrets, with things better left unspoken. We are looking not for a murderer, Hastings, but for someone who is desperately trying to protect something hidden in the house, something that could destroy them all." "Do you think you'll find it?" Hastings asked, his voice low with concern. "I will," I said, my voice steady. "But the key, Hastings, it is not just a key to a door, it is a key to a deeper mystery, and we must be ready for what we find when we open it." As I spoke the words, I could not shake the feeling that we were on the cusp of discovering something far more dangerous than we had imagined. The mansion, its walls thick with secrets, had begun to close in on us, and soon I feared we would find ourselves standing before a door that had no return. Chapter 9. A hidden passageway. The night had fallen silent, the house bathed in a muted darkness that seemed to press against the windows like an insistent hand. The heavy air of expectation that had filled the halls of the Hawthorne estate for days was now almost unbearable. I had walked the corridors of the mansion time and time again, revisiting the same rooms, the same faces, each time with the same questions. There was something within these walls, a secret that had driven someone to murder, something that remained hidden, locked away, elusive. It was in the early hours of the morning, when sleep eluded me, that I found myself again standing before the locked door that had been so central to my thoughts. The key. That confounding object, its faint symbol, its strange origins, kept returning to me. What did it unlock? The lock it was meant to open had no obvious match within the house. The mansion was full of doors, yes, but none seemed to fit. But the more I considered it, the more certain I became. The key was not merely a physical object. It was a symbol of something deeper. I stood before the door now, my hand resting lightly on the doorknob. It was one of the many rooms I had yet to explore in its entirety, and I had left it for last, knowing that whatever lay behind it might hold the final answer. Perhaps this would be the moment when the puzzle finally fell into place. But the door remained stubbornly locked, just as it had been when I had first examined it. The faint scratch of the key's symbol still teased at the edges of my memory, but it was not enough. Yet I could not shake the nagging feeling that something, or someone, was guiding me here. My mind turned to Caroline Vane and her cryptic references to doors, to hidden spaces, to things that had been sealed away for too long. Perhaps she had not been as innocent in her involvement as she had seemed. I glanced back at the dimly lit hallway behind me, ensuring that no one was watching, before I slid the key into the lock. The soft click as the lock disengaged was almost too quiet, too easy. And yet it was the sound of something far more significant, the sound of access to a long-forgotten place. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor shrouded in shadows. I stepped into the darkened passageway, feeling a slight draught against my face, as though the very air in the house was exhaling in relief at the disturbance. The floor was covered in thick dust, undisturbed for years, perhaps decades. The smell of old wood and mothballs clung to the walls, and my footsteps echoed unnervingly as I moved forward. At the far end of the passage, partially obscured by cobwebs and forgotten remnants of furniture, I saw what appeared to be a small, wooden door. My heart quickened as I approached it. The key, I now realized, must unlock something hidden in this very space. I placed the key in the lock, and once again there was that satisfying click. With a gentle push, the door opened to reveal a small, dimly lit room, filled with the heavy scent of age and neglect. It was a storage room, its contents shrouded in dust and forgotten relics. But what caught my eye immediately was the safe, a small, inconspicuous thing tucked away in the corner of the room. It was old, built of iron, and had a set of complex dials that seemed almost out of place in
a house such as this. I walked toward it, my mind racing.
Could this be it? The key had led me here, and surely it would be the one that opened the safe. As I crouched in front of the lock, I hesitated for a moment. The symbols on the key, now that I was standing before the safe, seemed to resonate more powerfully. Was this the answer I had been seeking, or merely another step in a never-ending game of deception? My hands worked quickly, and after several moments I heard the satisfying click of the safe's mechanism releasing. The door swung open with a faint creak. Inside was not a fortune in jewels, not stacks of money, but rather a few old papers, yellowed with time. At the very top of the pile was a small, leather-bound journal. I hesitated only briefly before I pulled it free, feeling the weight of it in my hands. This was it, the thing I had been looking for. The journal of Julian Hawthorne himself. I opened it carefully, my eyes scanning the faded pages. The handwriting was elegant, but the words on the pages were anything but comforting. The first entry was dated several years ago, shortly after the renovation of the house had begun. It read, "I have begun to see things, strange things, shadows, in the walls, whispers when there is no one else around.
I know that this house has secrets, but I cannot help myself. I will find them. I must find them. The key is the answer. The key he had known, even back then. But had he known what it truly unlocked? Or had he only sensed that there was something
beyond the veil of his understanding, something that called to him? I turned the pages, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on me. The entries became increasingly erratic, the language more desperate. One in particular stood out. "Eleanor has returned. She says the house cannot be undone. I do not know what she means. She tells me that the key must not be used, that the door must not be opened. But she is afraid, and I am not. I will do what I must. I will not let this house defeat me." Eleanor. That name again. The woman from the past. Had she come back to warn him? Or had she too been involved in something far darker? My thoughts churned, but I could not afford to lose focus. The journal was giving me more questions than
answers. And yet, I felt as though the answers were within reach. Hawthorne had clearly been obsessed with this house, with its secrets, with the key. But why? And what had he discovered that was so dangerous? I turned the final pages, my eyes scanning quickly now, desperate for some sort of conclusion.
The last entry was dated just days before his death. "I have unlocked it. The door has opened, and I see what lies beyond. But it is not what I thought it would be. I am being watched. I am being hunted. I do not know who I can trust. The key
has opened something terrible, something that will destroy us all." The words were scratched out in places as if he had written them in a frenzy.
The journal ended abruptly, leaving me with nothing but the unsettling feeling that Hawthorne had indeed unlocked something far more sinister than anyone had anticipated. I closed the journal and looked around the small room, the shadows now pressing in on me. The safe had revealed this, these fragmented pieces of a man's life. But they did not bring me any closer to the truth of his death. The key had led me here, but its true purpose was still unclear. Was the key merely a means of unlocking physical doors, or had it opened something far darker? And who among the people I had questioned, Mrs. Hawthorne, Miss Eleanor, Mr. Trent, Caroline Vane, was involved in this dangerous game? I could feel the weight of the mystery bearing down on me, but I knew this was only the beginning. There were still many more secrets to uncover, and the key, whether it opened doors or minds, was still at the center of it all. Chapter 10. The Business Partner's Secrets. The room was still as I closed the journal, its pages full of mystery and half-revealed truths. A faint sense of unease lingered in the air. Something about the discoveries of the past few hours, the key, the journal, and the locked room behind it all, felt like the final pieces of a puzzle slipping out of place. Yet the more I uncovered, the less certain I became about the true nature of the crime. The answers, I suspected, were buried somewhere far deeper within the mansion's walls. As I stood there, my mind whirring with possibilities, I knew I had to return to the other pieces of this web. The people, the motivations, the tensions. The business partner, Mr. Gregory Trent, remained a particularly perplexing figure in all of this. I had already seen his nervousness, heard his strained words under pressure, and his financial troubles were no secret. But there was something more beneath the surface, something I had yet to uncover. I summoned him, asking for another meeting, this time away from the prying eyes of the household. He agreed, though there was something hesitant in his manner as he entered the study. His face was drawn, and the edges of his suit were a little too carefully arranged, as if he were trying to conceal something. He sat across from me, his hands clasped tightly on his knees. "You wish to speak with me, Poirot?" Trent asked, his voice low and cautious, but still carrying an air of authority. "Yes, indeed, Mr. Trent," I replied, my eyes studying him carefully. "It is about your financial situation and the events surrounding your business dealings with Mr. Hawthorne." Trent stiffened at the mention of his finances, his posture betraying a flicker of unease. I had learned from my previous inquiries that his business dealings were far from prosperous. If anything, his mounting debts and financial missteps had pushed him into a corner, one he had been trying desperately to escape. He glanced away, his eyes flicking toward the door, as if weighing whether to speak at all. After a moment he sighed, settling back into the chair. "The situation is difficult, Poirot," he said, his voice a touch too calm, as if he were trying to suppress a rising panic. "But I have always been above board with my dealings."
As for my involvement with Hawthorne, it was strictly professional. I leaned forward, my gaze fixed upon him. "And yet, Mr. Trent, your business dealings with Mr. Hawthorne were anything but professional. You had, as they say, a great deal to lose. Your debts, I suspect, were mounting. Was it not convenient for you that if Mr. Hawthorne were out of—"
"The way you could take control of the company and perhaps the estate as well." Trent's eyes widened, but only for a moment. He had not expected such an accusation, and his first instinct was to defend himself. "I had no intention of harming Julian," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I was simply trying to save the business." "But were you truly trying to save the business, or were you trying to save yourself?" I pressed, my voice steady, giving no quarter. "You see, Mr. Trent, the more I examine the evidence, the more I see that your alibi that night has some inconsistencies. You claimed to be in your room, yet no one saw you there. The staff were unaware of your movements, and when I spoke to Miss Hawthorne, she mentioned that you were not where you said you were. Perhaps you were not in your room at all." Trent's jaw clenched, and for a brief moment his eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and frustration. He had been caught in a lie, and there was no easy way out. He swallowed hard, then finally
spoke, his voice strained. I was out. I couldn't sleep, and I went for a walk. I know that sounds suspicious, but it's the truth. I swear it, he said, his tone almost pleading now, a far cry from the confident businessman who had first arrived. I nodded slowly, watching his every move. A walk? A late-night stroll in a house with so many hidden corners and locked doors?
Did you, by chance, come upon the very room where Mr. Hawthorne's body was discovered? He hesitated, his eyes darting to the side before he answered, his voice thick with tension. No, I didn't. I never went near the study. I gave
a faint smile. It is curious, isn't it?
That you would be out at such an hour and yet never see the very room in which the murder occurred. Almost too convenient. Trent shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and I could see the anxiety creeping across his face. There was something about him, something that told me he wasn't telling the whole truth. But what was it he was hiding? What more could he have known? It was at that moment that a fresh thought struck me, one that sent a chill down my spine. The key. Could it be that the key unlocked not just a room, but something far more significant? A hidden compartment, perhaps, where something critical had been concealed? It was the one piece of the puzzle that had eluded me, and yet I was sure it held the answers. The safe in the hidden room had contained the journal, but that was merely a clue. What if the key opened something else, something Trent might know about? I leaned forward, pressing on. Mr. Trent, tell me, do you know anything about a hidden compartment in the house? A box, perhaps, something important that Mr. Hawthorne may have kept secret? He stared at me blankly, but the flicker of recognition was brief, barely perceptible.
I don't know what you're talking about. I watched him closely. The denial came too quickly, too easily. The truth was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. The business partner had more to do with this mystery than he was willing to admit. As I stood, my mind turned again to the key.
The safe had yielded the journal, but now I wondered if it had been a mere distraction. What if there was a deeper secret hidden away, one that Trent or someone else had not wanted uncovered? I suggest, Mr. Trent, I said softly, that you reflect on your actions very carefully. The truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it is buried. I left him there, still sitting in his chair, his eyes wide and his hands trembling slightly. As I walked down the corridor, the weight of the key in my pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing step. The answers were close now. I could feel it. But who had the key, and what did it truly unlock? Chapter 11. A False Confession. The sun had begun to dip beneath the horizon as I returned to the house, the shadows growing long along the stone path. There was a weight in the air tonight, something charged and expectant. I had expected a final resolution to the puzzle of Mr. Hawthorne's murder, but as I made my way back, I felt only the creeping sensation of doubt. The puzzle was not complete, far from it. I had barely stepped into the study when the door swung open with a creak, and Caroline Vane entered. She was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she had been crying, though her appearance was too composed to suggest a recent emotional collapse. She closed the door behind her with a finality that seemed deliberate, purposeful. "Poirot," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something I could not quite place. I must speak with you. There is something I need to confess, I gestured, for her to sit, keeping my expression neutral, though my mind was already working, analyzing her every move. She seemed agitated, but it was a controlled agitation, as though she had rehearsed the words she was about to speak. I killed him, she said bluntly, looking at me with steady eyes. Julian Hawthorne, I killed him. The words hung in, the air between us, each syllable like a hammer strike on an anvil. Her confession, coming so suddenly, caught me off guard. I had expected many things, but not this. Not Caroline, the enigmatic artist who had been so elusive and distant from the start. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers steepled together as I observed her carefully. You killed him, I repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the words. Tell me, mademoiselle, why? What prompted this act of revenge? Her gaze shifted downward, her hands twisting in her lap. Revenge, she echoed, as if tasting the word. Yes, it was revenge, for all the years of manipulation, for the lies he told me, the betrayal. I watched her closely, noting the slight tremor in her voice, the way her fingers tightened in her lap, the way she avoided direct eye contact when she spoke of her motives. These were the signs of someone caught in a web of emotion and regret, but they were also signs of a story that was carefully constructed. Too carefully. But you were not in the room when he died, were you? I asked gently, my voice calm but insistent. The timeline does not fit. You could not have been there.
At the time of the murder.
She froze, her eyes widening slightly, before she quickly composed herself. I was there, she insisted, her voice gaining strength. I was there when he died. I saw him, his eyes. They were full of contempt for me, and that was...
When I knew I had to act, I couldn't let him get away with it. I raised an eyebrow, sceptical of her words.
Mademoiselle, you speak of contempt, yet there is no evidence to support this. The body was discovered hours after the estimated time of death. You could not have been there when he was killed, and no one saw you near the study. Her lips parted, and for a moment she looked as though she might crumble under the weight of my words. But then she seemed to catch herself, her posture stiffening once more.
I don't care about the evidence. I know what I did. I just wanted him to pay. I regarded her quietly, the silence thick between us. It was clear that she was hiding something deeper than the revenge story she was offering. There was
a dissonance in her confession, a mismatch between her emotions and the reality of the situation. Revenge was a powerful motivator. Yes, but something did not ring true in her words. I had seen enough lies to recognize one when it crossed my path. I do not believe you, mademoiselle, I said softly, my voice steady and calm. Your confession, while dramatic, does not match the physical evidence, nor does it fit within the timeline. There is something more you are not telling me. She stared at me, her eyes now brimming with a mix of frustration and fear. What are you suggesting? That I'm lying? She asked, her voice rising slightly. I nodded, unfazed by her outburst. Lying, yes, but it is not a lie born of guilt, for a crime you committed. No, mademoiselle, I believe you are hiding something else, something about yourself, something that relates to Mr. Hawthorne, but in a different way than you are telling me. For a moment, she said nothing. Her gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers beginning to twist once more. The silence between us stretched taut, and in that silence I saw the struggle in her eyes, the inner conflict between what she wanted to say and what she could no longer keep hidden. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from the very core
of her being, she spoke again. I didn't kill him, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper.
But I wanted to. I wanted to so badly. I sat forward, my expression one of calm attentiveness. And why is that, mademoiselle? What would drive you to such an extreme emotion? She seemed to deflate, as though the weight of her confession
had drained her. It's because of him, because of Julian. He ruined me.
He made me think I was nothing, an artist, yes, but only as long as I served his interests. He was never interested in me, not really. Not in the way I wanted. I nodded, processing her words carefully. There it was, the core of her turmoil. It wasn't murder that had driven her to the breaking point. It was betrayal, the bitter realization that her emotional attachment to Mr. Hawthorne had been nothing but a figment of her own making, a delusion she had created to sustain herself in the face of his indifference. Her confession, I realized now, had never been about the murder itself. It was about the grief and anger she had carried with her for years. She had loved Julian Hawthorne, or thought she had, and when he rejected her, used her and discarded her, she had been left with only a broken heart and a mind desperate for retribution. But this anger, I said gently, this desire to hurt him, it does not explain the events of that night. The truth is more complex than this. She looked at me sharply, as if suddenly realizing the full depth of the situation. You know I didn't do it, don't you? She asked, her voice trembling with both relief and fear. I didn't kill
him, but I wanted to. I wanted him to suffer. And in some ways I think I might have been the cause of his downfall. I studied her intently, watching as she grappled with the magnitude of what she had said.
The emotional truth was there, buried beneath layers of shame and fear, but the physical truth of the crime, the murder, remained elusive. Caroline Vane was not the killer, but she was deeply involved in the emotional landscape that had led to Mr. Hawthorne's death.
I stood up, my decision made. Mademoiselle Vane, you are not the murderer, but you do hold a piece of the puzzle that remains unsolved, and you will help me solve it. Her eyes followed me as I turned toward the door, but the tension that
had filled the room began to ease. She had confessed to something far less sinister, but I now had a clearer understanding of her emotions. There was more to the story, and I had yet to uncover all its layers. Poirot, she said, her voice small, do you think it's possible to forgive someone for what they've done to you? I paused for a moment, my back still turned to
her. Forgiveness is a strange thing, mademoiselle. It is not for me to decide.
But it is always possible if the heart is willing. I left the room, knowing the investigation was far from over. The key was still out there, the hidden compartments and motives yet to be fully revealed. And somewhere in this tangled web, the truth of Mr. Hawthorne's death remained elusive, but not for long. Chapter 12. Unravelling motives. The following days passed in a haze of long hours and cryptic conversations. The more I delved into the lives of those surrounding Mr. Hawthorne, the more tangled the threads of this mystery became. I had no doubt now the murder had not been a crime of passion, nor a simple act of greed. It was rather a carefully orchestrated scheme to bury the past, a past that Mr. Hawthorne had worked tirelessly to keep buried. The discovery of the hidden door was only the beginning, and the key, still elusive in its final purpose, had more to reveal. I stood in front of the locked room once more, the weight of the mystery pressing down on me with each passing minute. The house was still, but within it I felt a restless energy, a sense that something important was just beyond reach. I had not yet fully unlocked the meaning of the key, but I had not given up. My instincts told me that the hidden compartment it was meant to open held the truth. There was no need to rush. The case had already given me its clues, though some had been well concealed behind veils of deceit. What I needed now was to connect the dots, to see not just the individual pieces, but the pattern they formed when placed together. I had already spoken with Miss Eleanor Hawthorne and Gregory Trent again, but both had provided little new insight. Trent's business troubles were not the source of his emotional disturbance, nor was Miss Eleanor's aloofness purely a matter of grief. Both were hiding something, and Caroline Vane's sudden confession, though it had seemed like a crucial breakthrough, had only deepened the mystery. She had wanted revenge, but I suspected there was more behind her feelings, a deeper connection to the man whose death had ignited such fury. As I reflected on this, a sudden realization struck me. It was not the key itself that held the ultimate answer, but the history behind it. What had Mr. Hawthorne been so desperate to keep hidden? What could have prompted him to create such a secret compartment in his home, a compartment meant not for wealth or material gain, but for something far darker? I set my mind to the task. The key, I knew, was only part of a larger story. I needed to understand why it had been created in the first place and who had the most to gain from its contents being kept hidden. My thoughts drifted back to the early years of Mr. Hawthorne's life. I recalled something I had learned about his past, an event that had long been buried beneath layers of time and misdirection. It had come from the lips of Mrs. Hawthorne, though she had been careful not to speak too openly about it. There had been rumours surrounding Julian Hawthorne's younger years, whispers of a crime he had been involved in, a crime that had nearly destroyed him. I had put little stock in those rumours at the time, but now I began to wonder if they held more truth than I had initially thought. In the dimly lit study, I reached for the journal I had discovered earlier, the one hidden behind the door. The pages within it were worn and yellowed, but they had not been completely disfigured by time. As I turned through them, a series of cryptic notes caught my attention. They were written in a hurried hand, as though the writer had been attempting to communicate something important, but without fully committing to the clarity of thought. The notes were disjointed at best, and at worst, incomprehensible. But one word stood out: Blackwood. It was repeated several times as though it had been written with a forceful urgency. I paused, my fingers tracing the name. Blackwood, that name. It rang a bell. I recalled hearing it in passing. It was a small town, isolated in the rural parts of the county, a place where secrets were often kept, buried in the hills and mist. But why had Mr. Hawthorne been writing about it? I flipped the pages faster now, searching for more clues, and found another fragment that made my pulse quicken. The box must remain sealed. The past cannot return. The past. I leaned back in my chair, the realization dawning upon me like the slow uncovering of a hidden wound. The key did not open just any box. It opened a box that contained the secrets of a crime long forgotten, a crime that Mr. Hawthorne had been involved in, and the people in his life, his wife, his daughter, and his business partner, had all been caught in the web of that crime. They all had something to lose if the truth were to come to light. The more I thought about it, the more everything started to align. The people in Hawthorne's life had motives far beyond financial gain or mere personal vendettas. What they all shared was a desire to keep the past buried, and that desire had become a driving force, one that had caused a man to be silenced, perhaps forever. The pieces were falling into place now, but the answers still remained elusive. Caroline Vane's connection to the key was more than just emotional. I was certain of it. She had known something about the crime in Blackwood, perhaps something so damaging that it could destroy everything Julian Hawthorne had built. But who else knew? I walked back to the room where I had been previously, my mind racing. There was a sudden need to see the house again, to walk through its dark corridors and forgotten corners. Somewhere within its walls, the final truth lay hidden. The key, the hidden door, and the journal had all led me here, but there was one more thing I needed to do. One more person to question. I found Mrs. Hawthorne in the parlour, her eyes fixed on the fire as she sat by the hearth. She did not acknowledge my presence at first, but when I spoke, her head snapped up, her face taut with apprehension. "Poirot," she said quietly, "what is it you are searching for? What more could you want from us?" I studied her carefully. She had been evasive before, but now there was something about her that seemed different. There was a strain in her expression, a flicker of something in her eyes that suggested she knew more than she had let on. "Madame," I began, my voice calm but persistent, "I believe there is something you have not told me, something important about your husband's past, about a place called Blackwood. Do you know of it?" Her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. "Blackwood?" she whispered, almost too softly for me to hear. "Why do you bring that up?" I leaned forward, my eyes locking with hers. "Because it holds the answers to Mr. Hawthorne's death. I believe it is tied to the crime that he sought to bury." For a moment, Mrs. Hawthorne was silent, her face pale and drawn as if she were struggling to keep control of her emotions. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and reluctant. "I thought I had left that all behind me," she murmured, her eyes distant. "But the past has a way of coming back. We all have our secrets, Poirot. My husband, he kept his better than most, but no secret can stay hidden forever." The pieces were falling into place now, the murder, the hidden compartment, the key. It was all connected to something much darker than I had imagined. Something in Blackwood, something so terrible that it had forced Mr. Hawthorne to keep it locked away for all these years. And now someone was determined to ensure that secrets stayed buried, no matter the cost. Chapter 13. A Web of Lies. The days following my conversation with Mrs. Hawthorne were tense and fraught with a sense of urgency. Her confession, if one could call it that, had opened a window into a past that Mr. Hawthorne had taken such care to conceal. Yet it only raised more questions, each one more disturbing than the last. "Blackwood," she had whispered. A name I had yet to fully connect. Was it merely a place, or something more? Was it the key to the mystery, or merely a diversion? I paced in the study, contemplating the intricacies of the case, when a familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. Captain Hastings, who had been steadfastly accompanying me throughout the investigation, appeared in the doorway, looking more determined than I had seen him in days. "I've been thinking, Poirot," he said, stepping inside, "and I believe I've noticed something that might be important." I turned to him, intrigued but cautious. Hastings was not one for idle speculation, and I had come to respect his occasional flashes of insight. "What is it, mon ami?" I asked, motioning for him to elaborate. "It's something small," he began, his brow furrowed. Something I saw at the crime scene that I didn't quite register at the time, but now it seems out of place. I raised an eyebrow. Go
On. Hastings hesitated for a moment, as though choosing his words carefully. When we first examined Mr. Hawthorne's body, I noticed something odd about the position of the chair in the study. His favourite chair, you remember?
It was out of place, slightly askew. But there's more. I noticed a faint scratch on the armrest, a tiny gouge like something had been scraped against it. I nodded thoughtfully. Yes, I remember, but surely that's not enough to— That's the thing, Hastings interrupted. It's not just the scratch. If you look closely, the gouge is newer than the chair's wear. It was made recently, and it wasn't from Mr. Hawthorne's movements. I considered this. It was true that the study had been carefully examined, but the details Hastings pointed out were subtle and easily overlooked. It was the sort of thing I might have missed, especially with the constant distractions that had plagued the investigation. The chair was not disturbed by Mr. Hawthorne,
I said, slowly piecing it together.
But by someone else? Exactly, Hastings confirmed, his face lighting up. And that someone must have been in the room at the time of the murder. They might have even been the one to move the chair before Mr. Hawthorne collapsed into
it. I turned back to the desk where the various notes and documents related to the case were spread out before me.
The room was heavy with the weight of its secrets, and as I sifted through the papers again, I could feel the tension tightening. There were still too many unknowns, too many threads that seemed to lead nowhere. But Hastings' observation had revealed a new clue, one I could not ignore. Someone had been in the room, perhaps far earlier than we'd assumed. Merci, mon ami, I said, turning to him. This is most useful. Together we retraced the events of the night of Mr. Hawthorne's
death, considering this new detail.
The position of the chair was key. Someone had altered it, perhaps trying to obscure their presence or hide something about the scene. But why? Was it to buy time or to stage something to mislead us? My mind turned back to the key. It was, of course, central to the case, its significance growing clearer by the day, but I now saw its role not as merely unlocking a compartment, but unlocking the truth itself. The final door had to open, and the truth behind Mr. Hawthorne's death
lay within it.
The house was full of secrets, but there was one secret, buried in that hidden compartment, that would unravel everything. I turned to Hastings, who was watching me with a knowing expression. The key, my friend, I said slowly, is not just the means to access the box. It is the key to understanding everything that has happened here. It is the thread that ties the entire web of lies together. He nodded in agreement. I think I see it now, Poirot. All these people, Mrs. Hawthorne, her daughter, Trent, even Caroline Vane, none of them are as innocent as they seem. Each one has a reason to keep the past hidden. Yes, I murmured, more to myself than to Hastings. But there is still one question that troubles me. Who had the most to gain by silencing Mr. Hawthorne? And who among them had the means and opportunity? I paced the room again, my mind racing. The lies, the motives, the secrets, they were all swirling together now, forming a pattern that was starting to reveal its shape. Mrs. Hawthorne. Reluctance to speak, her evasions when I pressed her about her husband's past. Miss Eleanor's aloofness, her curious detachment from the events unfolding around her. Trent's financial troubles, his apparent desperation. Caroline Vane's confession, which had been both too convenient and too vague to be believed. Each person had a part to play in this drama, but which one had taken the final step, the one that led to Mr. Hawthorne's death? The key, I thought again. It was the final piece. Whoever held it controlled the secret. Suddenly I was struck by another thought, one that seemed so simple yet had eluded me until now. The key, the journal, the locked compartment, they were all part of a greater narrative, one that involved not just Mr. Hawthorne, but those closest to him. The affair, the old crime, the cover-up, it was all connected. I stopped pacing and looked at Hastings, my mind now racing with the clarity of sudden insight. Hastings, I believe we have been looking at this all wrong. It was not just the fear of a crime coming to light that led to Mr. Hawthorne's death. It was the fear of what would happen if that crime were ever exposed. The key was not just a key to a box, but to a legacy of shame that could destroy them all. Hastings raised an eyebrow. Are you saying that Mr. Hawthorne's death was an act of desperation, that someone killed him to protect that secret? I nodded slowly. Exactly. The person who murdered him wasn't just trying to cover up the past. They were trying to protect themselves from the repercussions of that past. They believed that if the key were ever used, everything would come undone. A moment of silence hung in the air between us, charged with the weight of my
words.
Slowly, Hastings' eyes widened in realization. Do you think one of them did it? He asked softly, almost as though afraid to speak the words aloud. I do, I replied, my voice steady. But which one? The pieces were falling into place, but there was still a crucial element missing. I could feel the answer within my grasp, but it remained just beyond my reach. There was one last question I had to answer, one that would bring all of this to a head. Who was the one who
had the most to lose?
Who was the one who had been willing to kill to protect a secret so dark that even time could not erase it? I knew that the next step would lead us to the final truth. And as I glanced at the key, still resting quietly on the table, I realized that the answer was closer than ever. It was time to confront them all, face to face, and finally expose the murderer. Chapter 14. The Final Twist. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the drawing room, casting long, dappled shadows on the floor. The house, with its air of quiet mourning, seemed to exhale a collective sigh, its secrets still murmuring beneath the surface. I sat in my chair, contemplating the twists and turns that had brought me to this moment when the puzzle was nearly complete, yet the solution remained tantalizingly out of reach. There was no denying the finality that had settled upon the investigation. Each person, every piece of evidence, every clue had been carefully examined, scrutinized, and yet the truth had not yet been laid bare. Something was missing, and I could feel it, like the last piece of a jigsaw puzzle that, once placed, would illuminate the entire picture. It was then that Hastings entered, his face unusually grave, his eyes narrowed with the kind of focus I had come to recognize when he, too, sensed that a crucial piece was at hand. He was holding a small envelope, its edges worn, the paper slightly creased. Poirot, he said, setting the envelope on the table before me. I found this while searching Mr. Hawthorne's study again. It was hidden in a drawer behind a stack of old correspondence, almost overlooked. I raised an eyebrow. Curiosity piqued. A letter? Or something else? Something else, Hastings replied, his voice low. A photograph. I took the photograph from the envelope, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was an old black and white photograph, the edges faded with time. In it, a younger Mr. Hawthorne stood beside a woman, her face partially obscured by shadows, but I could make out enough of her features to recognize something familiar. The woman's eyes, dark and intense, stared back at me from the photograph. Eyes
I had seen in someone else. It clicked. The woman was none other than Caroline Vane, the enigmatic artist who had so recently confessed to the crime. But what was she doing in this photograph with Mr. Hawthorne? What had their connection been, and why had she hidden this from me? I handed the photograph to Hastings, my mind racing. This changes everything. You don't think, Hastings began, but I held up a hand, silencing him. Not yet, I said,
my voice steady, but my thoughts whirling with possibilities. But this photograph is the key. We have been looking at this case from the wrong angle all along. The key that Mr. Hawthorne kept hidden was not just a symbol of secrecy, it was
a gateway to something far more significant, something deeply personal.
We had, for days, focused on the mystery of the hidden compartment, the key, the lies, and the motives of the people closest to Mr. Hawthorne. Yet, despite the numerous clues pointing in different directions, one thing had remained elusive, i.e., true understanding of Mr. Hawthorne's motivations. Why had he kept so many secrets? Why had he kept the key hidden? And why had he so carefully concealed his past? The photograph told me everything I needed to know. Caroline Vane, the artist who had been so mysterious in her own right, had been involved with Mr. Hawthorne years ago, but there was more to their connection than mere affection or a brief affair. No, this was deeper. It was a bond built on shared guilt, shared complicity in something darker than any of us had realized. I turned back to Hastings. This photograph confirms it. Caroline Vane
had not just a personal connection to Mr. Hawthorne, she had a reason to want him dead.
But why? What does this mean for the case? Hastings asked, his voice tinged with the frustration of not yet fully grasping the weight of my deduction. It means, I said slowly as I pieced the puzzle together, that the conspiracy was larger than we thought. Caroline Vane was not alone in this. She was working with someone else, someone we have overlooked. And that person, I believe, is the one who killed Mr. Hawthorne. Hastings's eyes widened. You don't mean... Yes, I interrupted. The murderer is someone hiding in plain sight. I stood abruptly, the realization hitting me like a thunderclap. It was not just Caroline. She had an accomplice, the one who helped her orchestrate Mr. Hawthorne's death. Someone close to him, someone with a deep-seated connection to his secrets. As I paced, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in rapid succession. Mr. Hawthorne's hidden compartment, the key, the lies about the affair, the strange behavior of the other suspects. Everything was part of a larger scheme, one designed to protect a secret that was worth killing for. I turned to Hastings, my voice filled with certainty. It was Gregory Trent. Hastings looked startled. But he's been the most forthcoming. He has nothing to hide. Or so it seems, I replied. But consider this. Trent was in dire financial straits, and he had a powerful motive to protect his interests. His connection to Mr. Hawthorne was far more complex than we believed. Trent knew about the secrets Mr. Hawthorne had kept hidden, and he feared that these secrets would be exposed. He was involved in the conspiracy, yes, but he was not the mastermind. I paused, looking directly at Hastings. It was Caroline Vane who pushed Trent to act. She used him, manipulated him, but it was she who had the most to lose. She and Mr. Hawthorne had been involved in a crime long ago, one that could ruin them both. But Trent, he was desperate. He was the one who murdered Mr. Hawthorne to silence him, to ensure that the truth remained buried forever. But why go to all this trouble? Hastings asked, incredulous. Why kill him if they were already hiding the truth?
Because Mr. Hawthorne had finally decided to come clean, I said, my voice low. He had begun to talk. He was ready to reveal everything, even if it meant destroying the lives of everyone around him. And Caroline Vane knew that. She couldn't allow that. She was too deeply entrenched in the past to let it all unravel now. I turned to the table where the key still lay, untouched. It had been the symbol of their conspiracy, the means by which they had hoped to bury the past.
But in the end, it had only served to expose them all. The key was never just about the box, I said softly. It was about control. Control over the past and the future. Mr. Hawthorne held it, but he no longer needed it. His death, in the end, was the result of a desperate attempt to keep a past secret. And it worked, until now. I straightened, my gaze unwavering. It is time to confront them. Time to end this game once and for all. Chapter 15. The Grand Dénouement, the Grand Hall of. The Hawthorne estate was, as usual, grandiose in its silence. The heavy wooden beams above and the faint creak of the old floorboards only added to the air of anticipation. In the centre of the room I stood, flanked by Hastings and the gathered group of suspects. The tension in the room was palpable, each individual watching me closely, unsure whether to expect a revelation or to prolong the uncertainty. Mr. Gregory Trent, whose nerves had been steadily unravelling over the past few days, stood at the back, his posture rigid, though his eyes were darting around as though he expected a sudden accusation. Caroline Vane, her face still pale from her earlier dramatic confession, was nervously fidgeting with the hem of her dress. The other household staff, all of whom had been questioned at length, stood in an uneasy cluster, their eyes shifting toward one another as if expecting someone
else to betray them.
Had gathered them here not merely to confront them with the evidence I had painstakingly uncovered, but also to demonstrate how every part of this twisted puzzle fit together, piece by piece, until the final image could no longer be denied. Hastings, standing to one side, gave me a look of curiosity mingled with faint apprehension. His own observations, though valuable, had always been secondary to the careful deductions I had made, and it was time now to lay everything bare. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, signalling that the time had come. "Mes amis," I began, my voice carrying effortlessly through the room, "we are gathered here today to finally untangle the web of lies that has surrounded us for far too long. The mystery of Mr. Hawthorne's death, of the key, and of the secrets buried within this very house has occupied our minds. But as always, the answer lies within the little grey cells." I allowed a slight pause, watching as their faces shifted ever so subtly in response to my words. I could see that Caroline Vane, still flustered from her earlier confession, was tightening her grip on the back of a chair. Gregory Trent's mouth twitched, but he remained silent. The others watched me with a kind of fearful expectation, as if they were waiting for the final judgment to fall upon them. I stepped forward, my gaze sweeping over each of them. "Let us begin at the beginning," I continued, my tone even, almost conversational. "The key, which has caused so much confusion, is not just an object. It is the symbol of something far more significant, something hidden from all of us. From the moment I found it, I knew it was not a mere trinket, it was a key to secrets that had been kept locked away for years." I turned to Gregory Trent, who stiffened visibly under my scrutiny. "Mr. Trent, you have been a key player in this mystery."
"Have you not?" I asked, not without a touch of irony.
"Your financial troubles, your association with Mr. Hawthorne, these were all carefully constructed to divert suspicion. But the truth, my friend, is far simpler. You were not the murderer. You were simply a pawn manipulated by someone else with much more to lose. Trent's face flushed, and he opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, silencing him. "That person," I said, turning my attention to Caroline, "is none other than Miss Caroline Vane." Caroline's breath caught, and for a moment I thought she might faint. Her face drained of colour, and her hands trembled where they rested on the back of the chair. "Yes, Miss Vane," I said softly. "You believed you could fool me with your confession, but it was all an act, wasn't it? Your dramatic admission, your tears, none of it was sincere. You wanted us to believe you were guilty, but the truth is much more sinister." The room seemed to hold its breath as Caroline's eyes darted nervously from me to the others. She said nothing, but the tension in her posture betrayed her guilt. "You see," I went on, "Caroline Vane had the most to lose. She and Mr. Hawthorne shared a dark secret, one that, had it been revealed, would have destroyed them both. The key, you see, was not meant to open a mere box or compartment. It was meant to protect the past, to keep their shared crime locked away forever." I paused again, allowing the words to sink in. Caroline's face remained pale, but her lips pressed together in a thin line, as though bracing herself for what was coming. "I had suspected this for some time," I continued. "The photograph of you and Mr. Hawthorne hidden in the drawer revealed the truth. The connection between you two was not just an affair. It was far deeper, a shared guilt that neither of you could escape." Caroline looked away, unable to meet my gaze, her lips trembling. I could see the weight of her past hanging over her, like a storm cloud. "But why murder Mr. Hawthorne?" Hastings interjected, his voice full of disbelief. "Surely she didn't need to kill him just to keep their secret?"
"Ah, mon ami, it is here that we find the true motive," I replied, turning to face him fully. "Caroline Vane killed Mr. Hawthorne not just to protect her secret, but out of a far more personal and deep-rooted emotion, jealousy and revenge. She had been betrayed by Mr. Hawthorne years ago. You see, there was another woman involved, someone Mr. Hawthorne had loved, someone who had cast aside Caroline when the time came for him to make a choice." Caroline flinched at the mention of the other woman. It was clear that the old wound had never healed. "He never loved me," she whispered, her voice shaking.
"I was just a fool, too late to realize what he was doing to me. But I loved him. I loved him with all my heart. And when he planned to confess, when he finally decided to expose their shared crime," I went on, my eyes never leaving her face, "it was the final straw. You couldn't allow him to do that. You couldn't bear to see him destroy everything you had built, everything you had sacrificed for him." Her shoulders slumped in defeat, and for a moment I thought she might break. But she remained silent, as if she had no more words left to offer. "Yes, Caroline Vane," I said, my voice firm. "You killed him because of jealousy, because of a long-buried hatred that had festered for years. But you were not alone in this. Gregory Trent, you were the one who provided the means to silence Mr. Hawthorne permanently. You were the one who helped her execute the murder." Gregory Trent stood motionless for a moment, and then his shoulders sagged, the last of his resolve crumbling.
"I didn't mean to," he began, his voice weak, but I cut him off. "You helped Caroline, Mr. Trent, because you were desperate. Your financial ruin, your fear of losing everything. These were the strings she pulled to manipulate you into assisting her." Trent's face twisted in shame and he hung his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I took a step back, letting the gravity of the moment settle over them all.
The key, as I said, was never about the compartment. It was about protecting secrets, about keeping a past locked away forever. And it worked, for a time. But in the end, it was not the key that held the power. It was the truth. The room was silent. I could feel the weight of the moment, the sense of finality hanging in the air like the last note of a symphony. "A crime," I said, my voice ringing clear, "is a puzzle, Mayami. And only the little grey cells can find the way," I allowed, myself a small, satisfied smile. "Justice, as always, has prevailed. The case is solved.